The doors you built. I set the new dehumidifier on the cinder block ledge after work. Yellow tag still zip-tied to its handle so it wouldn't forget what it cost me. The town posted a mildew advisory that afternoon. Little text alert, county seal, language about basements and basements feelings. The advisory had that polite scolding tone we get whenever it rains 3 weekends in a row, and the river grows the kind of brown men nod at and say it, just silt. The basement air had that sweet rot edge, wet cardboard, apple peels left in a bag, the smell that precedes a complaint. I ran the hose to a bucket because the drain at the floor low point runs like a room and not water, then plugged the cord into the outlet I'd replaced last winter. The compressor clicked like a grasshopper and settled into a toothy hum. In my house, everything with a motor announces itself. The fridge has a higher pitch than you'd expect for its size, like it's embarrassed to be big. The washer is blunt. The box fan upstairs when I can't sleep sounds like a cheap airplane that never lands. By 9, the dehumidifier's bucket held brown tea. The color looked wrong. The manual called it condensate, like it wanted the word to reassure me. The smell said otherwise. I leaned in and got that hit you get when you crack a cedar chest you swore you'd de-air out last summer. Old wood oil soap that always smells faintly like a church basement lilacs from a yard we sold, and a struck match gone damp. I'm not proud, but I touched a drop to my tongue. It was curiosity and the bad kind. It tasted like somebody let a broom soak overnight and then wrung it into a glass. It had a sweetness that might have been a memory. It had the copper hint of a penny roughed on your teeth when you were a dumb kid, seeing if money tasted like grown-ups. The house shifted its weight. I don't know how else to say it. It made a little creak above me, like a person leaning back on their heels to see around your shoulder. Upstairs, the fridge hum jumped a pitch and then held like it had remembered a part. The crooked family photo in the hallway, a frame that never level because the nail never found a stud, straightened as if someone had put their thumb on the bottom corner and gave it a judge's look. My head went to blame, because blame is a safe road. Air handling, a vibration wave. When I climbed the basement steps slow and careful so I wouldn't have to admit I'd hurried, the photo was straight. The faces were ours. Mine with my half smile I use when I want to keep from making a second expression. My wife's, ex-wife's, if we ever get the papers past our throat. Eyes on whoever took the shot. And her mouth with its chip on the front tooth, buried in a grin. The kid between us wasn't from that day. He was from one summer later, hair longer, some new shirt sleeve stain on his shoulder I remembered nagging about. We had taken that other picture at the lake after we made a talk we still haven't finished, and the second one was from a picnic where nothing was fixed. We never swapped frames. The wood was the same. The nick in the lower right from the time I should have had a level was still there. The boy in the frame had aged by our argument in the wrong direction. I opened the junk drawer because that's what you do to prove to yourself that you were still in your own house. The drawer had stacked itself into piles a person could name, unpaid, unsent, unkept. Rubber bands that used to tangle like a little nest lay stretched into a quiet circle around thumbtacks in a line like a short fence. The pencil with the hardware store logo that had been chewed halfway down had its teeth marks smoothed out as if someone had taken a finger and pressed every ridge until a piece of wood remembered pre-mouth. The spare room, treadmill with the one belt hiss, boxes that never commit to being unpacked, showed a crib-shaped dent in the carpet I couldn't explain. I stood in the doorway and stared at the dent like it made me a measurement. The room had no crib. The indent curved where the rail would have sat, 2 legs worth visible. There was a pale square on the wall where a mobile might have hung if we had ever taken it out of the box, and a brass ring scratched arcs where a person might have turned an old stroller to face a window. My wife's chipped daisy mug, mouth smooth along the chip because it had been hers for 10 years, waited in a taped box by the door with a Sharpie legend, "Kitchen, overs." I'd have put it in the attic 2 months ago because I couldn't make a decision about it. The attic had the smell of summer baked and saved. The mug wasn't supposed to be anywhere I would kick it. Now it looked like someone was making a gentle threat that wasn't a threat at all. Decide. Sleep went thin. It had been going that way since she left, but that night it was like a sheet you keep pulling and can to remember cutting down to size. Each time the dehumidifier filled it, slid rooms closer to what I de-dodged. The keys I lied about swinging on the hook while they'd been in my truck cup holder the whole time. The bottle I hid rising from the basement sill like a fish when the light hits it just right. The text I never sent because you can rewrite a sentence in your head 100 times and never shave it down enough to slip it under the door. The house felt like a person correcting your posture with a flat hand between your shoulder blades and with patience I didn't deserve. If you buy one, don't taste it. Dump the bucket outside, well away from your steps. That is what I would tell the version of myself who stops at Hartigan is Hardware half an hour before closing, because the clerk there doesn't ask what you were fixing, just points with his chin and lets you be a man with a problem. If you already did, speak the truth out loud, room by room, before the house finishes. I wrote that in my head like a label on the kind of machine with a blade you shouldn't trust yourself around. I didn't say anything out loud, because I didn't want to sound foolish in my own halls, which is one of the dumbest reasons I've made a choice. At work the next morning, I stopped twice at the service bay door because the traffic light on Kellam blinked a timing that used to be solid. It hung yellow a heartbeat longer, red shorter, green just the same, long as always, but the switch between red and green felt like a throat clearing. I drive a town truck that needs a belt the county won't approve until July. It squeals after rain like a creature being embarrassed. I drove it under those lights with my hand on the wheel, and the radio turned low for the report about the advisory. They said the rainfall had pushed mold spore counts into a bracket with a number I couldn't place, and that people with compromised lungs should stay cool. They used phrases like likely and suggested and further monitoring because the voice on the radio never wants to sound like an alarm until it's been told. The garage smelled like hydraulic fluid and damp cardboard, the good smell of work and the stale smell of unpaid. Dan in the next bay had a coffee that Dee forgotten to be coffee a long time ago. He said, "Hear about the advisory?" Without asking a question. He said it like his molars had agreed to carry that sentence for him, and he was offloading. "I got a new machine," I said, which was true if not the point. "Sucks it right out. Condensates something." "You sound like the manual," he said, grinning, and went back to a brake job that would be for a guy who didn't care if the metaphors lining his day were efficient. Dan had a wife who brought sandwiches. He kept the corner of one in his shirt pocket and forgot it there sometimes. His life makes it clear when something is wrong because he remembers what right looks like. On my lunch break I drove home. The truck seat had a squashed bottle top under it I'd been meaning to fish out for 3 years. It wasn't there. The little ridge where it cut my thigh every time I let my mind leave the lane was gone. The shop towel I kept wadding beneath the seat had folded itself into quarters and then an eighth, as if a mother had taught it. Outside, the notice board by the diner had 3 new sheets tacked up. Town Hall. Notice, chlorination schedule adjusted. Second service church bake sale moved. Basement closed for remediation. Rain barrel workshop postponed. The tacks lined up like I was supposed to trust the world more because the corners behaved. My house from the sidewalk looked like the same house. It's a 1.5 with a roof line that dips like a shrug, white siding gone grey in places where morning shade keeps the paint honest, a maple that drops the same number of leaves you expect, and then a few more, because trees like to remind you don't get to be certain. The porch light fixture sat a degree crooked like a lazy eye. The storm door never latches on the first go. I know the trick where you pull a hair off the hinge and it will. But that afternoon it clicked as if someone had reminded it how. The smell at the threshold was ready to be called clean, laundry powder and the kind of cool you tell yourself belongs to stone. Up the steps, the picture frame with the same wood, and Nick had the wrong season in it. I didn't stare this time. I said the words I always say when I want to make a thing ordinary. Fine, out loud. The words sounded like a small napkin trying to cover a spill. The basement air still had that lot behind the grocery sweetness. The hose ran a good thin line into the bucket. The bucket's surface had a skin like tea you forget on the stove long enough to learn to be stubborn on top. I took it out the bulkhead and sloshed it into the corner of the yard where the grass goes patchy because clay comes to the surface whenever it rains enough. You begin to think you live under a bowl. The puddle it made soaked into the ground like it had been invited there. 2 daffodils up the slope stood straighter, if I'm selling you something. The dirt gave that kind of darkened shine a man wants from a fresh coat of oil on the good wrench. I stood there too long with the bucket empty and felt like I'd come up from something and hadn't brought the right offering. The second fill came slower, but it came. I did not taste it. I told myself that was because I had already done the stupid thing, not because I was afraid. Around 8, a knock came at the door that sounded like a neighbor using his knuckles, because he thinks a doorbell is a request you make of someone, not a courtesy you offer. It was Jack from next door, the kind of man who wears work boots after work because his feet trust the weight. He looked at me like he had a problem he thought I might have practice with. "You got a dehumidifier?" he asked. I said, "Yeah." He looked down, like the question had been the whole conversation, then back up like the rest of it had arrived on time. "Ours is fighting air. It's losing to," he said. "You smell it?" He rolled one shoulder. "Like the church basement, 10 months after a flood." "I got a bucket going," I said. "I can bring it over if you want to dump a hit near your foundation. Might not do much. The ground's a sponge made out of memory right now." "Memory," he said, and let the word turn in the back of his mouth as if testing it for bitterness. "You staying cool?" "Trying," I said. "Good," he said. And then, because we don't linger over the polite questions, he said, "You seen her?" "I don't know which her you mean," I said, which was true and not. He nodded because he didn't need to climb inside my sentence to know its rooms. "All right," he said. "Town says boil if your water smells funny. Ours smells like it wants to be tea when it grows up." "You boiling?" I said. "Boiling," he said, and lifted his chin toward my house. "You?" "Boiling," I lied, and he let me. When he went down the steps, his boot scraped a line across the landing where I sanded at the old paint 2 summers ago, and gave up because the lint from the sander made me think of snowdrifts and not the good kind. The dehumidifier emptied a 3rd time after 10. My body knows when it's 10 because the news guy says the word sports in a tone that suggests he believes more things fit under that word than under most. I put the bucket outside, further from the steps like I'd learned something, and poured slow. The sound of water on dirt found a pitch that matched the fridge 3 rooms away. I stood there with the bucket in my hand and thought about my wife's chipped mug. I could throw it away. It would be a decision. I could put it back in the attic. It would be the opposite. I brought it to the sink instead and washed it like it had been in use all week, gentle around the chip because your hand remembers more than your head. I set it upside down on the towel. The towel had a stripe I'd never noticed before. Blue running through a field of white, like someone had thought of the sea and then forgotten everything but the color. My phone buzzed on the counter, not her. Dan. "Boil notice officially now," he wrote. "Town's pushing it. Something in the tests. Not bad, just cautious." He doesn't write like that. He puts a period at the end of everything. He had no period. He had cautious. The river grows brown after rain. The voice on the radio says further monitoring. The county says likely. All the words are cousins who marry each other. By midnight, the bucket held enough to dump again. I told myself I was going out one last time like a man promising a last cigarette. I took the bucket to the corner where the clay shows itself and poured a slow circle. The circle sat, didn't sink as quick. The air above it chilled like a hand lifting sweat off your neck. The maple shivered when there was no wind. I said a name out loud and then wished I hadn't. The name didn't change the air. I stood there caught between the two rooms in the house that come to you when life gets thin. The fridge and the bed. The fridge promised sound. The bed promised fights with it. Morning brought a letter in the little mailbox slot that nobody uses except the town, when they want you to think something matters enough to be delivered with a sound. Water service advisory, it said, like a person who's already said hello twice. Boil water until further notice. Do not use for infant formula. That last sentence had weight to it. I took it into the kitchen and put it by the chipped mug and didn't read it again because I did not want to see the phrase until further notice inside my house twice. Work was work. We serviced a generator at the clinic because the clinic had its schedule change, and a generator is supposed to keep strangers' bodies from making a different choice while they were waiting. The generator ran fine. The mechanic in charge of it said it sounded like a tractor that ate right. I heard a little hitch when the load hit and kept it to myself because men resent notes about hiccups when they've just convinced themselves they won die on the highway this year. On the way back, the truck's belt squealed when I turned in at Kellam, and the light held yellow for an extra breath that matched the generator S-dip for reasons I could draw on a sheet of paper if you gave me a ruler and a set of words you didn't care about. When I got home, the house smelled like the inside of a drawer you shut quick because you don't want to see what you've been keeping. Not bad, not good, kept. The dehumidifier had filled while I was out, the line on its bucket like a notch scratched with a knife tip. I poured it in the far corner. The patch of clay took it like a patient. An hour later, I went back out and the circle stood in a shallow depression, the dirt around it higher like a ring of flower bed. Two little piles had risen like the ground, remembering how to be pushed. The middle of the circle was darker, not just wet dark, brown like tea, only thicker at the edges. I took my boot and scuffed the ring. It resisted as if the ground had set its jaw. I moved my foot away. The ring settled itself back to round the way a puddle will if you leave it alone. The rest of the house had two kinds of change. The kind you can sell yourself as a recall you should have made anyway, and the kind that rubs your shins against a piece of furniture you were sure had never been there. Receipts that used to curl like desiccated bugs lay flat, corners square, totals legible in the light. A jar full of screws I keep for the comfort of knowing I can be ready had sorted itself by thread and head and confidence. The box of photographs that makes a person feel like he has done something by moving it twice in a night had one envelope in it addressed to someone who isn't me in my handwriting. The envelope felt like a pebble in a boot. I didn't open it. I put it under the rest of the photos and told the box it had done enough for one day. By the fourth day, the air in the house had a cleanliness that wasn't mine. It's different when a person cleans a house and when a house stands up and does a piece of the work itself. When a person cleans, you hear water, you hear the hateful sound of a vacuum, you hear the way your own breathing turns labored and superior. When a house cleans itself, you hear nothing, and then you hear yourself. This is not the kind of quiet that brings you peace. This is the kind of quiet that won't take your excuses. I developed the habit of narrating myself in a low voice, like the men in my family do, when they were trying not to leave a room in a worse state than they found it. Put that back, I said to myself when I set the screwdriver on the wrong shelf. Not that one, when my hand reached for a glass and found the daisy mug. Easy, when the basement step with the split treads caught the edge of my heel in the same place it always did. The house didn't comment. It breathed. The dehumidifier clicked and hummed and spit out a brown tea that made a circle in the yard that now looked like a tire someone had half buried. The spare room changed the most. I stopped going in there because it hurt to look at the dent and not name it. On Wednesday, I looked anyway, as if duty wore a face. The treadmill had slid 3 inches toward the wall behind it. The boxes had rearranged. A foam wedge pillow that had always leaned like it was listening lay flat like someone had decided the room needed lines. On the carpet, besides the crib-shaped dent, there was a new one I recognized from a time before when naming things felt fruitful. A ring where a playpen would have stood. The wall with the pale square had a picture hook that had not been there a week ago. If you've ever had a hook appear where no hook was, you know it disturbs you in a way a person can't meet with a laugh. The town moved the Farmer S Market to the high school parking lot because the square by the mill smelled like wet rope and kept people away from the kettle corn. The market looked wrong up there. Asphalt is impatient. Dirt makes space for a fig jam, and a man who tells you it is his grandmother's recipe gives you a little of his childhood when you hand him money. Up there between painted lines on the blacktop, people stood with their reusable bags and talked about the advisory and voices that did the thing you do when you want to become likelier just by saying likely. The bakery sold a bread with a name that requires a soft mouth to pronounce. In line, the woman in front of me texted someone. Upstairs, closed at the hair place, mold in the vents. The water table that the county sets up with a banner that asks you to remember that pipes are not imaginary. Handed out flyers with neat sections. Boil, test, discard, repeat. We've got free test strips, the kid said behind the table, his hair tied back with a section of string that made the same sound as a guitar string when he tugged it. For what? I asked. He smiled in the direction of his training and said, peace of mind. I took 2 strips and put them in my shirt pocket where they would become a crumpled intention. My boss added a second shift to us because people done tea like being told to boil water and then turn their faucets without complaint. He said it like he was telling me the gardening club had to cancel the plant sale again because last spring, S Flats hadn't any tea recovered. I took the second shift because I tell myself I make time for trouble rather than find it waiting. When I got home a little after 10, the dehumidifier's compressor had adopted a richer note. It sounded like men in a barbershop harmony deciding on a chord where nobody wants to be the show-off. I watched the bucket rise like a tide chart in fast forward, and something in me that could still appreciate the daily mundanities said, look at you doing your job, you small machine with a polite idea of what air ought to be. I dumped the bucket in the far corner again. The circle in the yard had heaved higher at the ring. It looked like a tire now, buried deeper. On the inside of the ring, a fine white growth had started. Not the mold that grows on bread you forget, or the fuzz on a peach you never meant to buy. This was with intent. It looked like the fluff that happens when wood settles into linen. I crouched and smelled it and wanted instantly to be somewhere else. The scent took me to a church basement where the smell of coffee yuan tea meant to enjoy floats under a layer of fellowship and end tables. A laundry room 13 apartments back where someone always left a blue rag on a knob and the floor had paint flecks from a color you'll never see. A hospital hallway with floor wax laying down, clean as if trying to keep up with sorrow. My mother's closet, where a plastic bag tried to keep roses alive long enough for memory to call them flowers. I backed away and felt like I had stepped into myself one step too far. Don't. That's what I said, to nobody in particular. Thursday morning, the town rang my phone with a voice that had trouble making the shape of urgent. Due to heightened counts, it said. Avoid basements if you are sensitive. That word sensitive slid over the tongue like a candy you don't want to admit you like. Avoid, it said. Likely, the voice said. Short term, it promised. The school sent a separate message. Upper hallway closed, students rerouted. Thank you for understanding. Understanding is free. It costs another kind of coin later. I should have said truths. That would be the simple sociology of this. Things get better when you say the thing you hid from yourself in rooms that have watched you skip steps. But truths don't show up in paragraphs. They nudge. They leave notes with no signature. They make you walk back to the dehumidifier to check the bucket 3 times an hour, even when the light on its face will tell you when it's full. They make you sit on the second to last step of the basement stairs and taste the air like a dog after thunder. They make you pick up the daisy mug and put it down and pick it up and do that dance for the length of a radio ad for a hardware store that says words like durable and surface preparation like a hymn. They make you take the test strips out of your pocket and dip one into the condensate like a man testing a river by tow while the current has decided what you are. The strip turned a brown, neither the instructions nor the dye chart prepared for. The chart had lime green for okay, and yellow for caution, and orange for see a man with a clipboard. Brown had no friend. I touched it with one finger, and my finger smelled like floor wax. I washed it, and my hand smelled like church. By Friday, the ring in the yard had a lip. It had moved soil up the way ants can move a hill 1 grain at a time if you let them be industrious and give them a sentence to write to each other about a queen. I hadn't seen ants. I had seen only the lip. It had a ragged quality like old bread pulled apart. The white at the inside edge looked more like a plant now, and less like a memory of something that had been folded. I could hear a damp nothing at the center of the circle, the way your ear picks up a dehumidifier in the next room. A sound like the house thinking. I got the shovel I keep on the side of the porch and tamped the ring down. It held and then lifted back up after I took my foot away. You can't argue with certain kinds of persistence and leave with dignity. I called her. "Hey," I said, as if months hadn't been in between, as if the last conversation between us hadn't involved a sentence I said 3 times, because I wanted it to become true by repetition, and she sees through that method better than I do. She said, "Hey," in a way that meant we both knew what our voices were trying not to carry. I said, "You remember that mug?" And then I hated myself for starting with a mug, but I said it. And she said, "The daisy one," and I said, "Yeah." She let the yes lengthen like a leash she'd learned not to pull on. I said, "I kept it," which she already knew because she knows the places I hide concessions to my better moods. She said, "Okay." I said, "There's a thing happening with the house." Silence, then a tiny laugh, not unkind. "There always was," she said. I waited for her to say more. She didn't. My mouth found a sentence. "It is finishing things I never finished." Another silence. "Like what?" she said. My eyes went to the spare room door like a dog hears the fridge. "Like the way the photo frame has a different summer in it," I said. Another little laugh. "You hung it crooked," she said. "It straightens when the door shuts." I looked at the door. It wasn't moving. "This is different," I said, and listened to myself. I sounded like a boy saying the creek looks deeper today. She said, in a voice that remembered the 2 of us past the fight, "Don't drink the water." I said, "I'm boiling," and she made that sound that means the rest of the sentence is, "I know you. Don't make me be your nurse from away." She said, "Our boy's got a cough," and my body went cold because I had wanted a hook to hang my care on, and there it was, and I didn't know what shape I threw at it. "Is he okay?" I said. "He's fine," she said. "Just a cough from Jim in old air." Then she said, "Don't come by. I don't want the basement on your clothes." She meant mold. She meant history. I said, "Okay." The call ended without goodbye because we are still polite even when we don't like the script. That night, the dehumidifier took in more than it had the other nights. The bucket filled twice as fast, like the house had given up pretending its air wasn't a thing you could wring. When I carried the second bucket to the yard, I smelled the sweetness as soon as I pushed the door open. Stronger, less like a basement, and more like somebody emptying a bowl of potpourri into a dryer. The ring had a deeper center. I don't know where the dirt had gone. I took the flashlight and aimed its circle. In the very middle of the ring, the soil had a depression the size of a dinner plate, as clean-edged as anything in nature wasn't supposed to be. The bottom of the depression held a shine that could have been water or something else trying on the look of it. I poured the bucket wide, avoiding the center. The liquid hit the lip and hung there, a meniscus like a held breath, then slipped over and down to join whatever had claimed the bowl. "Don't," I said again. After I spoke, I heard the house answer, not words, a shift, a little capillary creak from upstairs, like a person rolling over and deciding to show you their shoulder. The fridge hum climbed a note and settled. In the spare room, I imagined a mobile slowly turning above no crib, and then hated that I had given the not crib moving parts. I went inside and closed the door, and made myself stand with my back to it until my heart slowed. I made tea with tap water that had been boiled 3 full minutes by the microwave, by repeating the time with my eyes open and the second hand on the wall clock, not the wrong time. I poured the tea into the daisy mug. I did not drink it. I held it and let the steam make my face damp, and then set it down and walked it back to the sink and emptied it and watched the swirl, just like I have since I was old enough to form the habit of making something leave a kitchen. Saturday morning, the town set cones across the end of our street and a sign on a post that hadn't needed a sign before. Water crew, work ahead. A crew came with a backhoe and trucks and sawed the street open with a machine that takes a man's voice if he stands too close all his life. The crew boss wore a vest with reflective tape that made him look official enough I could hate him for telling me what to do. He looked like a decent man doing a job. They pulled a section of pipe like a rib and set it on a sawhorse, and it lay there wet and embarrassed. People stood in their yards in sweatshirts and looked at the hole and talked about the weather while wanting to talk about the river and not wanting to say flood. The crew went home at dusk. They left the cones like a bedtime story. The spare room had changed again. I made myself go in. The boxes had moved into a logic that made me nauseous, like waking up inside someone else's list of what matters. The treadmill had inched to center itself under the light. The chalk line on the wall from when I thought I'd put up shelves had been rubbed with a sleeve as if to say, not that. On the carpet, the ring where a playpen would have stood looked sharper. The air was cooler in there than the rest of the house. I stood and let the cool brush my arms. I thought, if I say a thing out loud in here, it will be heard. I said, "We lost a baby," which was not the right sentence, but it was the one I had let sprout. The house did not answer. The dehumidifier in the basement clicked and hummed, and the bucket notch line rose. I called my mother. She lives out on Beach Road where the houses know more field than pavement. She answers the phone like it surprises her gently. I told her about the advisory and the work crews and the dehumidifier. I did not tell her about the ring in the yard. She told me to be careful because a man she knows from church put his foot through his own cellar stairs and had to sit there in the hole until a neighbor heard him swear. She said, "Have you been in the spare room?" As if she had heard the sentence I hadn't said out loud in there. I said, "I'm going room by room." She said, "Good," and then changed the subject to the neighbor's new dog and the old dog's disapproval in a way that let us both get off the phone without labels. On Sunday, the sign by the cones read, "Boil until further notice," in thick marker, like someone had been told to add the phrase the way you tell a child to put their homework in a folder. Church let out early. The town's air had Sunday in it. Quiet with a melted edge, like butter left on a plate while dinner goes another way. The ring in the yard had grown an inch taller. I put the shovel into it and took a slice like someone cutting cake as punishment. The slice held together and smelled like a broom left wet. I carried it to the garbage can. The can had a clean bag. I put the slice in and tied the bag and carried it to the curb even though it wasn't the day, because I wanted the ritual of making it not mine. When I turned back, the ring looked the same. That's humility, or the opposite. That night it rained. The kind of rain that makes it sound like the whole sky has agreed to a job and isn't asking for applause. The dehumidifier sang under the song Machine Against Weather. The fridge took the high harmony. Around midnight the power clicked off, and then on and then off again. The lights in the kitchen held, then went. The house stopped humming and became itself. I could hear the river fussing 4 blocks away. I could hear a siren from past the rail yard that didn't belong to us. I could hear my own mouth. I stood in the dark and went to the dehumidifier because the sudden absence of its little toothy music made a hole I needed to put my hand in. In the basement, the air had a wetness to it that you only meet when your hands have already tried and failed to dry a thing. The dehumidifier was quiet, the little green ready light dead, the compressor ever so slightly warm from effort. I put my hand on it. It felt like a dog that had run a fence all day and wanted a palm to understand the work. I said, "You did good," which is the kind of talk I learned to use when my boy was small and had to give a toy up at the table. The sump pump hiccuped once, just the voice of a pipe letting you know gravity still wins. Then I heard it, a little noise from outside like a fork set down too careful. I went up the stairs and stood with my hand on the back doorknob until my head told my hand to turn it. The ring had filled to the lip. It didn't look like water, not the way a puddle keeps its skin. It looked like the surface of something waiting and trying not to scare me. It reflected the porch light when the power came back on flicker by flicker like a learned trick. I stepped off the stoop. The rain had stopped a minute ago because weather loves timing. I could smell the maple and the garbage can plastic and the white stuff at the ring S-edge, which had grown like a doily nobody S-aunt admits to owning. I knelt, and the knee of my jeans took a thumbnail of dirt. The center of the ring had a movement to it like breath under a shirt. I said a sentence I hadn't rehearsed. "We had a second name picked out," I said. The center moved. I stood up and backed one step, and I think the word I'm avoiding is bowed. The ring didn't deepen. The surface settled as if the room had heard a prayer and agreed to pretend. On Monday, the crew pulled more pipe and declared on Facebook with a kind of civic cheer that the problem was isolated and addressing, which is a sentence people write when they have supervisors. The advisory in my pocket got another crease because I folded and unfolded it whenever I picked up the daisy mug to move it and put it back. The spare room stood open and cool. The mobile that wasn't tea there swung when air my body made with its own heat moved into space. I put my hand on the doorframe and said another sentence, quiet enough to pass for swallowing. "We hadn't tried since," I said. The house felt larger for a second, like a person drawing a breath to let a shirt out. I went to work. Dan had a cough. He blamed the belt dust. The radio said likely and recommended, and further monitoring, and in the same breath told a story about a festival in a county that didn't care about mold because they had money for tents. At lunch, I sat in the truck and wrote on a receipt just to see if the words would change themselves when I wasn't looking. "I drank once in secret," I wrote, and didn't like my handwriting. I put the receipt in the ashtray I use for screws. When I got back home 12 hours later, the receipt sat on the table, not in the ashtray, and the sentence had 2 words added in my hand that I don't admit to enjoying the look of. I drank once in secret again. I stood at the table and let the truth land like a boat. The dehumidifier had filled 3 times. I could tell by the line on the bucket, the way a man can tell how his day has straightened by the marks on his hands. I took the bucket to the yard. The ring had grown again, the lip ragged and wet and almost lovely if you detach yourself from the fact that it was my house making a purpose. I poured wide. The liquid slid down the inside edge and pooled at the center and lay there with a patience I could have loved if patience hadn't been what I lacked in all my best mistakes. I said a different sentence. I lied about the money. The surface quivered. I said, I took it for the bottle. The surface stilled. I said, I would do anything to undo it. And the surface remained what it was, which is how you know a machine understands more about love than we do. It accepts the parts you can't sand down. Tuesday night, the crew finished their work, and the town posted a new notice on the signboard by the diner. Lifted, it said in marker, that had made a man proud of his block letters. The guidance that hadn't been guidance became an invitation to go back to something that now felt risky. The voice on the radio said the words, "out of an abundance of caution," which made me smile in the way that hurts. The house didn't change because the county needed the story to resolve. I turned off the dehumidifier and listened. The house didn't exhale. It held. I left it off and went upstairs and sat in the spare room across from the dent and the ring and the cool. I held the daisy mug in both hands like a man on a porch. I spoke the sentences in the order they should have arrived when it mattered to say them out loud to a woman who wanted to hear them and had asked for 3 years with open hands. I lied about the bottle I took from the box. I put the letter back before you saw it. I wanted to be somebody who could say I didn't and then become him. We didn't try again, not because of fear, but because I refused the kind of hope that makes men honest. The air in the room moved into my shirt and out. I waited. The mobile I had imagined moved like I had blown on it. I had not blown on it. I put my forehead on the doorframe and breathed and let the smell of paint and old wood move into me the way a stubborn song will if you give it a second refrain. I went back to the basement and turned the dehumidifier on. The compressor clicked like a grasshopper and the hum set in, and the house vibrated along every part it had. Picture nails and the tiny screws in outlet faces and the bright heads of steel in the stairs. The bucket filled over the next hour. I took it out and poured it into the ring that my house had made out of dirt and weather and confession. The surface at the center lifted toward my face in a way I can say wasn't a greeting. I felt a tug in my chest like you feel when you crest the small hill that hides the river and see it full for the first time since last summer, and somebody you love is beside you breathing. I said nothing. Wednesday was quiet. The town returned to its usual density of sirens. The bakery turned on its ovens at 4, and the smell moved down the street, and a man running late to a life turned his head and got a free memory. At work, Dan's cough went away because he believed in the story where belts make you sick. I believed in a different story, which made my day longer. When I got home, the ring in the yard looked less like a lip and more like a bowl. The white edge had a pattern in it, like the lace on the table that comes out at Easter. I touched the white with one finger. It underfingered like a mushroom in a woods you don't enter without company. I washed my hand with dish soap that smells like a beach you've never taken your family to. In the spare room, the dent looked smaller. I do not know if that's true. It's what I saw. I stood in the room and said, because I wanted to make sure the house would correct me, we didn't lose a baby. The house did not correct me. I allowed myself to be a man, not undone by a room for a full minute, and then I made tea with water I did not boil because I am weak for the version of reality where towns do their jobs, and their jobs do not reach into basements and arrange a man's drawers. The tea tasted like tea from the first time we bought the mug at the church, rummage when money was thin. I drank it and washed the mug and set it down to dry and felt like I'd done everything wrong and everything half right at once. By the weekend, the ring had taken in more of what I gave it than I thought possible without overplaying its capacity. I poured until I wanted to know where it had gone. When I stepped to the edge and looked down, I saw that the bottom of the bowl was not water. It was house. The bottom reflected my kitchen window at a depth that wasn't there. It showed the picture frame with the wrong summer in it at a distance measured in sentences I hadn't said. It showed the basement steps from below like a person watching a man climb out after making a polite trouble for himself. I blinked. The ring returned to dirt and a wet that wanted to be named and a white lace that resisted because it did not need me. I backed away and laughed without pleasure because once, long ago, I had thrown a stone into a river and thought I could erase a skip mark from my life by watching it sink. On the last night I'll tell you about, a wind worked through. It's the kind of wind that likes the maples and the sight of a man standing in a yard after dark with a bucket in his hand, thinking he gets a vote. The dehumidifier had run steady. The bucket was heavy in my hand. I went to the ring and poured. The surface took what I offered. The kitchen window reflected where it had no right. The house made that shift again, a little change like a weight set down on the upstairs floor. The fridge climbed a note and held. In the spare room, something turned. I said a name, not hers, the other one. It left my mouth like a penny. The surface held. I moved my foot 1 inch. The back door behind me eased toward its latch and discovered what it was for. When I reached for the knob, I found it wasn't a knob anymore. It was a handle that wanted down and not turn. The door had finished itself while I had been making offers. The door knew what we had built, which was a house with rooms for truths you avoid and a shape you refuse to recognize until it walks out and shakes your hand. I tested the kitchen door, and it offered me the same. Down, not turn. The front door, with its brass oval and the worn spot where my thumb has sat for 15 years listening to myself fumble, now had a square of hardware that sat like a mouth pressed flat. Down. All the doors I had made in my life had decided to be honest, and in their honesty had become only the kind that open if a person speaks like a man and not like his loyalty to silence. It is not magic. It is wood and metal persuaded by air and time. The spare room was cold. My breath showed itself like the first time the year gets serious. I put my hand flat on the doorframe and said a sentence without ceremony. I am sorry I made a house do this. The air in the room warmed by a degree measured in mercy. The mobile I had imagined, a hand-me-down from a friend in a town a long way over, moved without argument, as if someone small had yawned in a sleep where large people are finally quiet. The dent in the carpet held, persistent like a tide line in a place that doesn't want to admit it smells like salt. I went down the steps to the basement and turned the dehumidifier off. The hum left, and the house took its long breath, and the fridge measured it, and the night put a shoulder against the siding to feel how we had hung it. The ring in the yard waited without impatience for whatever I would say next. There is no science in this, except the science of men who don't want to disappoint their own mothers and learn too late the shape of that want. There is no ghost either. Not if you think of ghosts as people with opinions. There is only a house finishing without you if you refuse to. I did not move for a long while. The clock over the sink ticked 1 second after the other, each one equal, none of them kind. Somewhere a train whistled like a boy practicing. A siren sounded from the road to the river where the light at Kellam pretends it wasn't measured by anybody who lives here. I said out loud, because the house had the dignity to stay. And listen, we had a second name picked out, and the sound of my voice didn't scare anything that mattered. I tried the front door handle then. It went down. It turned because I asked it the right way. That's the end of the lesson and the worst of it. The doors open only the way you've built them. If you have built them to answer to downward pressure and not the turning of a wrist that knows its work, then they will keep you inside until you learn how to stand in your own hall and speak what is yours to say. I sleep now, not easily. The bed makes the noises beds make, and I let them. Sometimes the fridge hums at a pitch that reminds me to be kind. The dehumidifier is off most nights. When it runs, I dump the bucket far from the ring. The ring is still there. It is lower now. The white has browned like lace in a drawer under a Bible. I sometimes stand near it and say nothing until the house shifts and reminds me it is not mine. In the spare room, the dent is fading like a bruise. The frame in the hall keeps its summers in an order that one stay put because time doesn't belong to us just because we tape the corners. I keep the daisy mug on the second shelf. I drink from it on nights when I can be trusted with soft things. When I wash it, I go gentle around that chip, because the mouth knows where to find forgiveness, even when the rest of a man doesn't. The town lifted the advisory the way they always do. Papers in slots, the Facebook page changed, a little article in the weekly about a nameless worker whose care made it happen. People went back to talking about the mill closing and about the highway extension and about how the river changes color like it wants to amuse us. They didn't ask questions about basements, because basements are where you keep your shape. I don't invite anyone down there. When I meet Jack on the steps between our houses, he looks like a man whose boots are still heavy enough to keep him where he belongs. He says, "You staying cool?" I say, "Trying." And he nods, because we know what it costs to be polite to a quiet. Sometimes I bring him a bucket of clear, and we dump it in his far corner and done to watch what it does. There's no ending to tell you that puts a bow on it. That belongs to different men in different houses with different patience. I can tell you that when I put my hand to the front door now, it gives to the movement I learned as a boy who was loved. I can tell you that in the hallway, the photo in the frame is sometimes the first summer and sometimes the next, and sometimes it is both if the light is wrong and the glass is dusty and I am ready to be contradicted. I can tell you that once or twice I woke to a sound like a small person walking to the end of a hallway in a house that knows how to rule, and stopped before the door because the door held and wouldn't it be wronged. When I hear that, I say the second name. I say it out loud, clear as a pipe under pressure, so the house doesn't have to finish it for me. And then I sleep again, which is the only kind of grace I am up to accepting. And I let the morning find me the way the river finds its bed after a season of trying something else. If this story lands with you, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys quiet, literary horror. Comments are open. Tell me your favorite image or line.